You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. I've been on an AI definition kick lately, so we'll continue that trend this week and explain what Retrieval Augmented Generation, or RAG, is, what problem it solves, and the different ways it can be implemented. Then I'll highlight an article I came across about how tech conferences have changed since the pandemic and the value that the author sees in them for 2024 and beyond, plus some ideas to help you justify going. First, let's start off with what is Retrieval Augmented Generation, or RAG. First of all, let's understand what the problem is that it's trying to solve. When you ask a question to an LLM, think like ChatGPT or some other type of chat model, sometimes it makes stuff up, or the responses that it gives aren't accurate or not even close, or it's just totally way off its game. Part of this stems from sometimes when you ask it things, it's not information it has. To understand this better, we need to understand that each model that gets released, there's a date cutoff for how much it's trained on. So, for instance, it scrapes the web, it grabs everything that it has up to a certain point, and then it takes a long time to train that model based on all of that data. And then that model gets released, and already the knowledge is a little bit outdated, not terribly so. But for instance, let's take the latest OpenAI model. It has a knowledge cutoff of September 2021 or somewhere around there. That means that the last 3 years of information that's been published, it doesn't have and doesn't know about. If you ask it something that's super recent, latest news, or something that's private knowledge, it might not have that information, and that's where it kind of just makes things up because it doesn't have anything relevantly close. Or even if it does, it'll kind of sound somewhat right and then be off. So one solution to this is to use existing data sources to provide extra information or access to that private knowledge or real-time data or whatever. It does improve the LLM's answers because the extra context can help provide it information it doesn't have or help weight the information that's important to help guide it into the area of expertise to look for the answer. Let's talk a little bit about just the terms themselves, because when you say Retrieval Augmented Generation, people are like, what? But if you break it down, it's really as simple as each word put together. Retrieval Augmented Generation. So retrieval is the first part. You're retrieving information from a data source. Now that could be a lot of different things, which we'll talk about in a second, but you're just providing some extra source of information outside the LLM. Then augmented, retrieval augmented. You are augmenting the LLM's answer with the data that you're pulling from that external source. So you're adding to it. If you're in music at all, that term augment is used a lot for chord progressions. Augmenting means raising or adding to. So in this case, it's the same meaning. You're augmenting or adding to the LLM's answer. The final piece is what the LLM's good at, generation. LLMs are very good at generating content. And so you are providing the data source from outside the LLM, you're augmenting the LLM's knowledge with that data source, and then the LLM is generating the answer based on that. So Retrieval Augmented Generation makes perfect sense when you break it down. There are a few different ways that you can do Retrieval Augmented Generation. First is one that my colleague actually showed me. Many of us probably do Retrieval Augmented Generation at a base level without even realizing it. When you talk to ChatGPT and you say, hey, write me an email, but you don't just provide it that. You say, hey, write me an email to Jane, confirming the information she provided in her last email is correct and accepting the calendar invite or date that she set up for us to meet, and then sign off. You've just provided it a name to send the email to. You've told it the information you want involved in the email body, and then you've told it how to sign off. That, in some degree, is providing extra context and extra information that the LLM wouldn't know otherwise. So you can do this in a lot of different ways. You can add external sources. You could say, hey, here's the previous email that Jane sent me. Respond to it in this way with these details and so on. That's a form of retrieval augmented generation. It's just providing extra context to the LLM so that it does a better job with its response. Now, We can also reference a document or a web page or some other data source. For instance, like I referenced the email from the initial person in order for it to respond. So you can do that. The last one is one that is often used in the tech industry, and that's to call a database to retrieve, pun intended, the data that's stored there in order to provide the information that's in the database as context to the LLM in its response. Businesses and applications have all of this massive amount of knowledge stored in all kinds of databases all around the world. Why couldn't we use those existing sources, already information that we've so carefully curated, and provide that to the LLM as an extra source? And that's what retrieval augmented generation is often about. Why would you want to do this? Well, we've already talked a little bit about providing information past the LLM's cutoff. We've also talked about providing private information as context that the LLM doesn't have access to. And then one comment that kind of got my wheels spinning a little bit at a conference prezo a few weeks ago was that calling a database is a lot cheaper than calling the LLM. So for instance, if we were to say, hey, LLM, write me an email, and then it comes back with something, you're like, oh, I didn't mean that. Actually, tweak this little thing, and I wanted you to write an email in the style of something. And so then it modifies its answer. You're like, not quite. I was looking for something maybe a little more tactful or a little more aggressive or a little bit whatever. And so you can do that, but every call you make to the LLM is costing at some level. So calling a database is often much cheaper than repeated calls to an LLM. If I can call a database or a few different databases, pull all that information together, and then make a single call to the LLM and get a better response back, then I'm money ahead, right? Or potentially, hopefully. Okay, so that's retrieval augmented generation. Now let's switch. I've kind of gotten away from the last few weeks in this podcast of talking about an article I've read recently, and I want to get back to that this week at least. So one that I recently picked up was The Case for Conferences in 2024. And the author, like many of us back during COVID, had made some interesting and maybe some crazy predictions for what life would look like on the other side of COVID. The one prediction that the author had made initially is that tech conferences will have changed. And it's true, it has changed quite a bit, and the author talks a little bit about why. First of all is that travel and budget is constrained. You're seeing a lot of companies want to reduce expenditures or the amount of time people spend on the road and so on. Also, the job market is tough, and professional development priorities have shifted, maybe sometimes less important or are more difficult to justify because you're often so busy with what's currently going on. I know for me specifically, I'm just trying to keep up in the AI space, how fast the market is moving right now. There's often not a lot of opportunity to really dig deep and focus in on developing those skills and really anything outside of that. And then last is that your organization or managers want to see a cost-benefit analysis and direct benefits of attending the conference. So how can you start to pull together all those benefits? First of all, if you're a speaker, building that rapport with developers and improving the personal relationships and awareness around your brand is definitely still worth it as a speaker. But what to do when you're just attending? I say just. Sometimes the general learning isn't enough anymore. Previously, you would say, I want to go to a tech conference to learn about X, Y, or Z. And they'd be like, go to the conference, do that, learn, come back and build great solutions. But oftentimes now in 2024 and probably beyond, that's not enough to justify sending someone to a conference. The author gives ways to evaluate whether a conference might be a worthwhile activity. Are the speakers known for doing things, building things, etc., or just talking about them? If they're actually building solutions, if they're providing real world experiences on what they've seen and what has worked and what hasn't and why, that is still very valuable. Second is, does the event make it easy to meet and learn from other attendees? Are there scheduled or blocked focused activities or time or space, etc., for people to interact with one another and learn from the problems they're solving and things they're working on a day-to-day basis? Last but not least, then, and third is, does the conference offer ideas and topics that are not easy to learn online? So if you can get that information publicly available from an online course or blog post, that's going to be harder to justify than something that you can't learn from existing sources. So latest and greatest technology or specific problems you're trying to solve that you haven't been able to access elsewhere, and there's some opportunities that the conference might help you solve those, etc. Those sorts of things can help you justify that. The author wraps up with some ways to justify to the gatekeepers at your org. First is a traditional business justification letter. ChatGPT can help in providing just a base outline, and there is a sample prompt offered for you to do that and tweak, of course. And then the other one is just to ask. Sometimes the folks at your organization are willing to give people those opportunities if they'll only just ask and raise the question in the first place. Doesn't always work, but hopefully that's the case. This week, we discussed the common AI architecture of retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, and how it's being used to improve responses or prevent hallucinations from an LLM. We also chatted about an article on how tech conferences have changed in 2024 and probably beyond, how you can still find value in speaking or attending, and how you can justify the benefits to the gatekeepers at your organization. Thanks for listening, and happy coding.